Wind cuts through the Colorado mountains like a blade. A lone cabin stands against the dark, its windows glowing while the rest of the valley holds its breath. Inside, a 47-year-old man who buried his family long ago stares at a single envelope on the table, one letter that could undo 12 years of silence. Outside, fire scars the hills. Inside, grief still smolders. And the woman sleeping in the next room has no idea the town is watching, waiting for him to fail again. By morning, a choice will be made: stay hidden and survive, or risk love and lose everything a second time. Because in places like this, miracles don't arrive loudly. They arrive when a broken man finally opens the door. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe it's never too late to start over, subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Colorado did not ease people into winter. It arrived without ceremony, without apology, and without concern for whether a man was ready. By late November, the high country had already hardened. The sky stayed a dull iron gray, stretched low over the mountains as if pressing down on everything beneath it. Snow did not fall gently here. It came sideways, carried by wind that scraped skin raw and forced breath deep into the chest. Nights dropped fast, swallowing the light before a man could finish his work, and the cold crept into places fire could not fully reach. The town below the ridge was small, the kind of place people passed through without noticing unless they needed something fixed. One main street, a diner that smelled of grease and old coffee, a hardware store that doubled as a meeting place, a post office that knew everyone's business before the mail did. People lived there because they were born there, or because they had nowhere else that felt honest. Jacob Miller lived above it all, where the road narrowed and eventually gave up pretending to be friendly. His cabin sat alone in a clearing carved from pine and spruce, a squat structure of darkened logs and a patched tin roof that rattled when the wind decided to remind it who was in charge. Smoke rose from the chimney most evenings, thin and steady, the only sign that someone still chose to endure this place. Jacob was 47 years old. He stood a little over 6 feet tall, broad through the shoulders, built from decades of labor rather than intention. His body carried the quiet strength of a man who worked because the work had to be done, not because anyone was watching. His hands were large and rough, fingers scarred and knuckles thickened by cold and repetition. They were the hands of someone who repaired more than he broke. His face had once been considered handsome in a straightforward way, before weather and grief reshaped it. The jaw was square, the cheekbones sharp, the skin worn dark by sun and wind. He kept his beard trimmed close, dark brown streaked with gray, not for appearance but because longer hair froze in winter. His hair matched it, cut short, practical, always slightly unkempt. His eyes were a pale gray blue, steady and unflinching, the kind that saw things clearly and rarely looked away. Jacob did not smile often. When he did, it was brief and unguarded, as if the expression surprised him as much as anyone else. He spoke the same way he lived, economically. He did not waste words. He did not offer explanations. Silence suited him, and over the years he had learned to live inside it without fighting. Each morning began the same. Before sunrise, he rose from his narrow bed, fed the stove, boiled coffee strong enough to burn bitterness from the bones, and stepped outside into air that punished carelessness. His boots crunched over frozen ground. The forest breathed around him, trees groaning under wind, snow sliding from branches, something small, darting beneath the white crust. It was a living place, but not a forgiving one. Jacob worked as a fire lookout during the warmer months and as a repairman year-round. Roofs collapsed, pipes burst, fences failed. Old men needed wood chopped and younger men needed help they were too proud to ask for. Jacob showed up when called. He fixed what was broken and left before gratitude turned into conversation. People in town knew him, though few knew him well. They knew his wife and son had died 12 years earlier, during a winter not unlike this one. They knew the accident had been quick and irreversible. They knew Jacob had changed afterward. What they did not know, or pretended not to, was how much of him had been buried with them. Before the loss, Jacob had laughed easily. He had gone into town on Sundays, held his wife's hand without thinking about it, believed life moved forward because it was meant to. Afterward, he learned a different truth. Life moved forward whether a man wanted it to or not. and caring too deeply meant giving the world permission to destroy you twice. He had not stopped loving. He had simply learned to ration it. That afternoon, Jacob drove into town because he was low on flour and lamp oil. The road was slick, and his old Ford moved slow but steady, tires biting where they could. Snow had started again, light but persistent, coating everything in a thin, dangerous sheen. Outside the post office, Hank Rowe stood smoking, collar turned up against the cold. Hank was in his early 60s, lean and bent slightly forward, his face permanently creased by years of logging and disappointment. A red knit cap covered most of his thinning hair, and his mustache drooped like it had grown tired of holding itself up. "Miller?" Hank said, voice gravelly. "Hank." They stood in companionable quiet for a moment, watching snow settle on the street. "You fixing the Patterson roof last week?" Hank asked. "Needed doing." Hank exhaled smoke. "You ever going to charge what you're worth?" Jacob shrugged. "Then folks wouldn't call." Hank studied him for a moment, then nodded toward the post office window. "You see the classifieds lately?" "No." "You should." Jacob didn't ask why. He went inside the general store instead, where the heater clicked loudly and the smell of stale coffee clung to the air. Mabel Green stood behind the counter, silver hair neatly cut, glasses hanging from a chain. She had known Jacob most of his life and did not tiptoe around him. "You're late today," she said. "Road's bad." She rang up his supplies, then looked at him over her glasses. "How are you holding up?" "Fine," Mabel sighed softly. "Fine is what men say when they don't want company." Jacob paid and gathered his bag. "Company makes noise." "Noise reminds you you're alive," she replied. Outside, snow had thickened. Jacob paused by the newspaper rack, pulled one, free, and flipped to the classifieds. He told himself it was curiosity. He told himself nothing. Lonely ads filled the page, practical requests, careful words meant to hide need. Widows, widowers, people afraid of sounding foolish for wanting something more than survival. That night, the storm came down hard. Wind slammed against the cabin. Snow erased the world beyond the windows. Jacob ate alone, the stove crackling beside him, the room heavy with memories he usually kept at bay. After a long while, he rose and found paper and pen. His hand hesitated above the page. Writing felt dangerous. But loneliness, he realized, was no longer quiet. It was loud enough to demand acknowledgement. He wrote plainly. His age, his work, his life. He promised no romance, no charm, no ease, only honesty, effort, kindness expressed through action rather than words. When he finished, he folded the paper and set it on the table. Outside, the storm raged on, indifferent. Jacob did not call it hope. He had learned better. But for the first time in years, he allowed the possibility that silence did not have to be permanent. The storm loosened its grip 3 days later, retreating the way it had come, without apology. Snow still lay thick across the clearing, piled high against the cabin walls, and pressed flat into hard, glittering sheets where the wind had scoured it smooth. The sky cleared to a pale winter blue that looked almost fragile after days of iron-gray weight. Sound returned slowly. The creak of trees settling, the distant crack of ice shifting. The world resumed its breathing. Jacob Miller resumed his routines. He shoveled a narrow path from the cabin to the woodpile, then to the truck. He checked the roof for damage, tightened a loose panel of tin, split firewood until his shoulders burned in a familiar, grounding way. Work had always been the language he trusted most. Work did not ask questions. It did not require answers. Yet the envelope remained on the small table by the window. He had not mailed it. Jacob told himself this was sensible, that writing it had been the necessary part, not sending it. Men did foolish things during storms. Loneliness distorted judgment the way cold distorted distance. He would burn the letter once the roads cleared and consider the matter closed. But he didn't burn it. On the 4th morning, he drove into town again, the road still slick but passable. His truck rattled over ruts half buried by snow, and when the town finally appeared below the ridge, Jacob felt an unexpected tightening in his chest. Not dread exactly, but anticipation he did not want to name. The post office sat at the far end of Main Street, a squat brick building with a flag snapping sharply in the cold. Jacob parked, cut the engine, and sat for a long moment with both hands on the steering wheel. He stared at the envelope resting on the passenger seat. It looked small, harmless, ridiculous. Finally, he grabbed it and stepped out into the cold. Inside, the post office smelled faintly of paper and old glue. A few people stood at the counters, bundled in coats, stamping feet against the chill. Behind the main desk stood Claire Donovan, the town's postmaster. She was in her early 40s, tall and narrow-shouldered, with dark hair pulled into a low knot that never seemed to come loose. Her face was angular, her expression perpetually composed, as if emotion were something she kept carefully rationed. Claire had come to the town after a divorce that everyone knew about and no one discussed. She had stayed because the town needed her and because staying was sometimes easier than leaving again. "Miller?" she said, recognizing him immediately. "Morning," Jacob replied. She took the envelope without comment, weighing it in her hand. Her eyes flicked briefly to the address, then back to him. "You sure?" The question was quiet, not judgmental, just accurate. Jacob hesitated, then nodded once. "Mail it." Claire slid it into the outgoing bin with a smooth, practiced motion. "It'll be in next week's paper." Jacob turned away before she could say anything else. Outside, the cold felt sharper. He climbed back into his truck and sat there, staring straight ahead, as if the mountains might offer reassurance. They did not. That evening, as the sun sank behind the ridgeline, Jacob heard something new beneath the familiar sounds of forest and wind. A thin, irregular noise. Not quite a bark, not quite a cry. He paused on the porch, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. A rasping whine, weak but persistent. Jacob grabbed his coat and flashlight and followed the sound to the edge of the clearing, where snow had drifted deep against a fallen log. Something moved there, dark against white. When the beam of light hit it, two dull amber eyes reflected back. It was a dog, medium-sized, maybe 40 pounds, ribs visible beneath a patchy coat that had once been black and now faded to charcoal. One ear stood half upright, the other folded forward awkwardly, as if it had healed wrong after a long-ago injury. Its muzzle was gray with age, teeth worn, breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts. The dog did not growl. It did not retreat. It simply stood there, shivering, watching Jacob with the wary exhaustion of something that had run out of better options. Jacob crouched slowly, keeping his voice low. "Hey." The dog's tail twitched once. That was all. He took a careful step forward. The dog did not move. Closer now, Jacob could see the stiffness in its hind leg, the way it favored one side, the frost clinging to its whiskers. This was not a young animal, not a stray passing through. This was a dog that had belonged to someone once. "You lost?" Jacob asked, knowing the question was useless. The dog blinked, then let out a soft, broken sound that might once have been a bark. Jacob sighed quietly. "Yeah," he murmured. "Me too." He took off his glove and held out his hand. The dog sniffed it cautiously, then, after a long moment, pressed its cold nose against Jacob's fingers. The contact was brief, but deliberate. That settled it. Jacob led the dog inside, dried it with an old towel, and set a bowl of water near the stove. The dog drank slowly, then lowered itself onto the floor with a weary grunt, curling close to the heat. Jacob found an old blanket and draped it over the animal's back. He told himself it was temporary, just until the dog regained strength, just until he could figure out where it had come from. But when he lay down that night, the sound of another living thing breathing in the room unsettled him in ways he had not expected. It was not unpleasant, just unfamiliar. The following week passed in steady work and quieter evenings. The dog, Jacob began calling him Bear, for the stubborn way he planted himself and refused to be moved, followed him everywhere with slow, careful steps. Bear was old, at least 10 or 12, and carried himself with the resigned patience of an animal that had learned pain was part of living. He was gentle, rarely barked, and seemed content simply to exist near Jacob, watching, waiting. On Friday afternoon, the newspaper arrived. Jacob did not read it immediately. He left it on the table while he fed Bear and chopped vegetables for stew. Only after he had finished eating did he unfold the pages, his hands steady in a way he did not quite believe. The ad was there. Small, plain. exactly as he had written it. Jacob stared at it longer than necessary, then folded the paper and set it aside. He told himself this was the end of it, that nothing would come of it, that people would read it, shake their heads, and move on. 3 days later, another storm began to build. That afternoon, Jacob was repairing a broken fence line for a neighbor when he saw Hank Rowe approaching across the snow, his gait uneven but determined. "You're famous," Hank called out. Jacob straightened, wiping his hands on his jacket. "That's so." Hank stopped a few feet away, breath fogging the air. "Post office got a letter for you this morning, out of state." Jacob felt something shift under his ribs. "That's unusual." "Claire said you should come get it," Hank added, watching him closely. "Said it looked like it might matter." Jacob didn't answer immediately. He finished tightening the wire, then gathered his tools with deliberate care. Bear watched from a short distance, head tilted slightly, as if sensing the importance of the moment. In town, the post office was nearly empty. Claire stood behind the counter, a single envelope resting beside her hand. Jacob recognized the handwriting at once. Neat, confident, unhurried. Claire slid the envelope toward him. "Didn't open it," she said, unnecessarily. "Thanks." "You don't have to tell me," Claire added, her voice softer now. "But if you ever want to, I'm around." Jacob nodded once and left. He did not open the letter until he was back at the cabin, the door shut tight against the wind. Bear lay near the stove, eyes half closed. Jacob sat at the table, turned the envelope over once, then tore it open. The letter inside was short, no flowery language, no apologies for writing. The woman, Emily Carter, introduced herself simply. She was 38, from Pennsylvania. She had spent the last 7 years caring for her mother through a long illness and had lost her the previous spring. She wrote of exhaustion, of silence that pressed too hard, of wanting a life that required her fully rather than slowly erasing her. She said she was not afraid of hard work or isolation. She said she understood grief did not vanish, but could be carried more honestly when shared. She did not mention love. She did not mention expectations. She ended with a single line. "If you think this letter is a mistake, I will understand, but I thought it was worth answering honesty with the same." Jacob read the letter twice, then a third time. Outside, the wind howled, and Bear shifted closer to the stove. Jacob sat very still, the paper warm in his hands, aware of something unfamiliar rising slowly in his chest, not hope, not yet, but the quiet realization that the world had answered him back. Jacob did not reply to the letter right away. He placed it back into its envelope and set it on the table, weighted down by a small wrench so the draft from the stove would not carry it away. The paper felt heavier than it should have, as if the words themselves had mass. He went about his days with the same deliberate rhythm, feeding Bear, checking fence lines, hauling water. But the letter traveled with him, present even when unseen. Winter deepened its hold. Mornings came brittle and white, the cold sharp enough to make metal sting through gloves. Bear followed Jacob everywhere, moving with careful patience, his stiff leg forcing him into a measured gait. Up close, Bear's age showed more clearly, cloudy edges around the eyes, a notch missing from one ear, a scar along his shoulder where fur never quite grew back. He was gentle, never demanding, content to sit close and watch. Jacob recognized that kind of endurance. It had a familiar shape. On the 5th evening after the letter arrived, Jacob built the fire higher than usual and sat down with pen and paper. He didn't start writing immediately. He stared at the blank page and thought about the difference between answering and inviting. One opened a door. The other asked someone to step through it. He began slowly. He told Emily Carter about the mountains and the work, about winter that did not forgive mistakes. He wrote about his age and his routine, about the dog who had found him rather than the other way around. He did not mention his wife and son by name, not yet. Instead, he wrote the truth he could manage, that he had lost people he loved and had built his life around not losing anyone again. He said he was not skilled at conversation, that silence came easier to him than most things, and that he believed honesty mattered more than comfort. He read the letter twice, then folded it and set it beside Emily's. He mailed it the next morning. The reply came sooner than he expected. A week later, another envelope appeared at the post office, Claire Donovan's neat handwriting labeling it with Jacob's name. This time, Claire studied him more closely as she handed it over, her expression unreadable but attentive. "You doing all right?" she asked. Jacob nodded. "Yes." She seemed to consider that, then said, "If you need time, take it. Mail waits. People don't always." Jacob thanked her and left. Emily's second letter was longer. She wrote of Pennsylvania winters that were cold but gentler than Colorado's, of a small rented house she was preparing to leave behind. She described herself plainly. Average height, brown hair worn loose or tied back depending on the day, hands roughened from caregiving and gardening. She said people often mistook her quiet for hesitation, but she knew her own mind. Caring for her mother had changed her, made her practical, less impressed by grand gestures, more attentive to what people did when no one was watching. She asked careful questions about the town, about the cabin, about whether Jacob wanted correspondence or something more deliberate. She did not pressure, she made space. Jacob answered again, then again after that. The letters formed a steady exchange, arriving every few days like a measured pulse. He found himself looking forward to the sound of tires on the road, to the weight of paper in his hands. Bear seemed to sense the shift. He waited by the door on mail days, tail giving a slow, hopeful wag. As weeks passed, the world beyond the cabin crept closer. Jacob went into town more often, partly for supplies, partly because the act of leaving no longer felt like an interruption. Mabel Green noticed first. "You're standing straighter," she said one afternoon as she rang up his groceries. "Snow's easing," Jacob replied. Mabel smiled in a way that suggested she didn't believe him. "Whatever it is, don't scare it off." He didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. The idea of meeting didn't come suddenly. It emerged the way dawn did in winter, slow, almost imperceptible, until light was undeniable. Emily mentioned she had vacation time saved, that she had never seen the Rockies except in photographs. She asked what spring looked like there. Jacob stared at the sentence for a long time. Spring, he knew, was not kind either. It came late, unpredictable, thawing just enough to make mud and false hope before winter reminded everyone it was not finished yet. Still, he wrote back. He described the snowmelt, the way the ground released itself inch by inch, the smell of wet pine and cold earth. He told her that if she came, it would not be easy, that the cabin was small, that he worked long hours, that he could not promise more than effort and patience. Her reply came 4 days later. She would come. Not indefinitely, not with expectations. Just to see. The decision settled into Jacob's chest with a weight that was both alarming and steadying. He prepared the cabin without knowing he was preparing. He fixed a loose hinge on the door, patched a crack near the window, cleared a second path through the snow. He borrowed clean linens from Mabel without explanation. He took Bear into town and asked Hank if he recognized the dog. Hank crouched, studying Bear with narrowed eyes. "Belonged to a couple up north. Passed last year. Dog wandered off after." Bear leaned into Jacob's leg. "Guess he picked you," Hank said. Jacob nodded. The day Emily arrived, the sky was clear and cold, the mountains sharp against it. Jacob drove into town earlier than necessary and parked across from the diner. He sat in his truck, hands on the wheel, feeling the unfamiliar tremor of anticipation. When the bus pulled in, he recognized her immediately. She stepped down carefully, scanning the street, her posture alert but unguarded. She was of average height, her build sturdy rather than delicate, dressed in a dark coat that had seen use. Her hair was brown with a hint of copper in the sun, pulled back loosely, strands escaping around her face. Her expression was calm, observant, eyes steady as they took in the unfamiliar surroundings. Jacob stepped out of the truck. Emily saw him and smiled, not broadly, not nervously, just enough to acknowledge recognition. She walked toward him, carrying a single bag. "Jacob," she said. "Emily." Up close, she looked tired in the way capable people often did. Fine lines around her eyes, hands strong and purposeful. There was nothing fragile about her. That, he realized, mattered. They drove in companionable quiet, the mountains rising around them. Emily asked questions as they came to her without urgency. Jacob answered honestly. When they reached the cabin, Bear greeted her with cautious enthusiasm, tail wagging in wide arcs. "He's handsome," she said, crouching to let Bear sniff her hand. "He thinks so," Jacob replied. That night, they ate a simple meal. They spoke about practical things, the weather, the work, the road conditions. There was no rush to define what this was. Outside, the cold settled in, and inside, the cabin held its breath. Jacob lay awake later, listening to the unfamiliar sound of another person moving in the next room. Fear flickered briefly. of change, of loss, but beneath it was something steadier. He did not know what would come next, but for the first time in years he had chosen not to face it alone. The first morning Emily woke in the cabin, the cold had already made its decision about the day. Frost rimmed the inside of the windows, turning the glass opaque at the edges, and the stove hummed low, holding the last heat from the night. Jacob was awake before she was, moving quietly out of habit rather than courtesy. He didn't know yet how to share space without retreating from it. Emily noticed the quiet immediately. Not the absence of sound, there was plenty of that, the pop of the stove, the slow creak of wood contracting, but the absence of unnecessary motion. Jacob didn't pace, he didn't fidget. He moved with intention, as if every step had been weighed and approved before it happened. She watched him from the doorway for a moment, taking in the details she had not fully seen the night before. In daylight, his age showed more clearly, fine lines at the corners of his eyes, a stiffness in his shoulders when he bent to add wood to the fire. His beard, trimmed short, was darker at the jaw and lighter near the chin, threaded with gray that looked earned rather than neglected. He wore a plain flannel shirt, sleeves rolled up, exposing forearms marked with old scars, thin white lines that spoke of years spent fixing what broke. "Morning," she said softly. Jacob turned, surprised but not startled. "Morning." There was a pause, not awkward but careful. Two people measuring the space between them. "I can help," Emily added, nodding toward the stove. Jacob shook his head. "Coffee's almost done," she smiled faintly. "Then I'll wait." That became the pattern of their first days. Observation before intrusion, questions asked sparingly, answers given honestly but without embellishment. Emily learned quickly that Jacob did not fill silence to make others comfortable. She also learned that he noticed everything. When she favored her right knee after long walks, when she rinsed dishes twice before setting them aside, when she paused at the window each evening to watch the light drain from the mountains. Emily, for her part, was not what Jacob had expected, though he could not have said precisely what he had expected. She was not fragile. Her movements were economical, her posture steady. She had the hands of someone accustomed to work. Strong fingers, nails kept short, skin dry from frequent washing. Her face was open, expressive without being demanding, and her eyes carried the kind of attentiveness that came from years spent caring for someone who could not speak for themselves. On the third day, Jacob asked if she wanted to come with him to repair a fence line damaged by snowmelt farther down the ridge. He framed it as information, not invitation. "I'd like that," she said. The walk was longer than it looked from the cabin. Snow softened underfoot, turning to slush where the sun reached it. Emily kept pace without complaint, though Jacob noticed the careful way she placed her steps. When they reached the fence, he handed her a pair of gloves and showed her how to hold the wire steady while he tightened it. "You don't have to," he said, watching her work. "I know," she replied. "But I want to." He nodded, accepting that answer the way he accepted most things, with quiet respect. As the days passed, the world tested them in small, unromantic ways. A pipe froze overnight and split, flooding part of the kitchen floor. Emily did not panic. She fetched towels, followed instructions, held the flashlight when the light failed. When Jacob finished the repair, she brewed coffee without being asked and handed him a mug like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You're good in a crisis," he said, almost to himself. "So are you," she replied. "You just don't call it that." Bear adjusted to Emily more quickly than Jacob had. The old dog followed her from room to room, settling at her feet when she sat, resting his graying muzzle against her knee. She brushed him each evening, working gently around his scars, speaking to him in a low voice that carried no urgency. "He's loyal," she said one night. "He's careful," Jacob corrected. Emily smiled. "Same thing sometimes." Midweek, Jacob drove Emily into town. It was not an errand he could avoid forever. The town noticed new faces the way the mountains noticed weather changes. At the general store, Mabel Green took Emily in with a single assessing look. "You must be Emily," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Yes, ma'am." "None of that," Mabel replied. "Anyone who survives a winter up here earns first-name privileges." Emily laughed softly, and something in Mabel's expression softened. "You staying long?" "A little while." Emily said carefully. Mabel nodded, glancing at Jacob. That's how it starts. Jacob said nothing. Outside, Hank Rowe leaned against the post office wall, arms crossed. His eyes flicked from Jacob to Emily and back again. Didn't think you'd do it, he said. Do what? Emily asked. Let the world in, Hank replied, then tipped his hat and walked off. Emily did not comment until they were back in the truck. He doesn't like me, she said. He likes fewer people than you'd think, Jacob said. You're doing fine. That night, a late storm rolled in unexpectedly. Snow fell heavy and wet, clinging to branches until they snapped under the weight. The power went out shortly after dark. Jacob lit lanterns. Emily gathered blankets without being told. The cabin shrank to the circle of light they created together, shadows climbing the walls like restless thoughts. As the wind howled outside, Emily spoke quietly. My mother hated storms, she said. She used to say they reminded her how small we were. Jacob stared into the lantern flame. They remind me how little control we have. Emily nodded. That too. Later, when the storm reached its peak, a sound cut through the wind, a sharp crack followed by a heavy thud. Jacob was on his feet instantly, pulling on his coat. A tree, he said, near the shed. I'm coming, Emily said. You don't have to. I know. They moved through the snow together, lanterns swinging between them. A pine had fallen across the shed roof, collapsing part of it inward. No animals were trapped. No one was hurt. But the damage was real. Emily stood beside Jacob, snow collecting in her hair. Can it wait until morning? He considered it. The storm, the dark, the effort it would take. Then he looked at her, steady and unafraid. Yes, he said, it can wait. They went back inside, snow melting into small dark pools on the floor. Jacob handed her a towel. Their fingers brushed briefly. Neither pulled away. That night, when the storm finally loosened its grip, Jacob lay awake, listening to the steady breathing of another person under his roof. Fear surfaced, as it always did, but this time it did not command him. It merely observed. In the morning, the world outside was altered but intact. The shed could be repaired. The cabin stood. The road remained passable. Emily stood at the window, watching light move across snow. You live a hard life, she said. Jacob joined her. It's honest. She nodded. That's why I came. He did not answer, but something inside him shifted. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but enough to matter. For the first time since his loss, Jacob began to understand that sharing the weight of daily life did not weaken it, it steadied it. The damage to the shed took 3 days to assess properly and nearly a week to begin repairing, not because the work was especially complicated, but because Jacob approached repairs the way he approached everything else, slowly, deliberately, and without shortcuts. Emily noticed that about him. He never rushed toward resolution. He waited until he understood the full shape of the problem, as if acting too quickly might invite something worse. The fallen pine had crushed one corner of the roof, splitting old boards and twisting nails free. Jacob stood beneath it one morning, hands on his hips, studying the damage with a face carved into thoughtful lines. At 47, his body still carried strength, but it was a seasoned strength, aware of its limits. His shoulders were broad, though slightly rounded from years of lifting and bending. His face, angular and weathered, carried a permanent seriousness softened only by the rare moments when he forgot to guard himself. It'll need new beams, he said. Can't just patch it. Emily stood beside him, bundled against the cold, her breath visible in short puffs. Do you want help? He hesitated. This part's heavy. I can still help, she replied evenly. I won't pretend to be stronger than I am. That honesty, offered without defensiveness, settled something inside him. All right, he said. We'll do what we can together. They spent the morning clearing debris. Emily worked methodically, stacking salvageable boards, setting aside bent nails, moving with care rather than speed. Jacob noticed that she asked questions before acting, not out of uncertainty, but respect for a process she was still learning. As they worked, Bear lay nearby, his graying coat dusted with sawdust, eyes half closed but alert. The dog was older than Jacob admitted aloud, 12, maybe 13, but he still rose whenever Emily stood, following her with quiet devotion. She scratched behind his ears each time she passed him, murmuring soft encouragements he didn't need. By afternoon, clouds began to gather again, low and heavy. Emily glanced at the sky. Another storm? Maybe not today, Jacob said. But soon. They packed up before the cold deepened, returning to the cabin with sore muscles and a silence that felt heavier than usual. Not strained, just full. That evening, Emily cooked. It was not something she announced or asked permission for. She simply stepped into the small kitchen and moved with quiet confidence. Jacob watched from the table as she worked, noting the way she adjusted the flame, tasted carefully, cleaned as she went. She did not cook like someone trying to impress. She cooked like someone who expected to be there tomorrow. The meal was simple. Stew, thick with vegetables and meat, but it carried warmth beyond its ingredients. You didn't have to, Jacob said. I wanted to, Emily replied. They ate without hurry. When they finished, Emily washed the dishes and Jacob dried them, an unspoken agreement settling between them. It was later, as the fire burned low, that the shift came. Emily sat on the floor, back against the couch, Bear's head heavy in her lap. Jacob sat opposite her, elbows on his knees, staring into the flames. The quiet stretched, not uncomfortable, but charged. You don't talk much about her, Emily said gently. Jacob stiffened. Not dramatically, just enough. My wife, he said. Emily nodded. I know. The fire popped, sending a brief shower of sparks up the chimney. Jacob's jaw tightened, the lines along his mouth deepening. He had known this conversation would come eventually. He had not decided how to survive it. She died 12 years ago, he said finally. Car accident. Winter road. Black ice. Emily said nothing. She did not interrupt, did not fill the space. We'd been married 20 years, he continued. Met young. Built this place together. His voice roughened. After she was gone, everything here felt loud, too full of her absence. Emily's hand stilled on Bear's back. That kind of loss doesn't go quiet, she said softly. Jacob looked at her then, really looked. There was no pity in her eyes, no curiosity, just recognition. She was the kind of woman who made rooms warmer, he said. Even when she was angry. A faint, fleeting smile crossed his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. After she died, I didn't want anyone else touching this place, didn't want to risk losing it again. Emily absorbed his words carefully. So you chose solitude. I chose survival, he corrected. Those aren't always the same thing. The admission sat between them, fragile and raw. Emily took a slow breath. My husband didn't die, she said, but he disappeared all the same. Jacob's brow furrowed. How? He got sick, she said. Early onset dementia. I watched the man I loved become someone else. By the end, he didn't know me, didn't know our children. Her voice remained steady, but her fingers curled slightly into Bear's fur. After he passed, everyone told me I'd been strong, brave, but what I felt most was empty. Jacob swallowed hard. I didn't come here looking to replace what I lost, Emily continued. I came because I didn't want to disappear inside it. The wind outside pressed against the cabin walls, a reminder of the world waiting beyond the circle of light. Jacob stood abruptly. I need air. Emily did not stop him. He stepped outside, cold biting through his jacket, breath fogging as he paced the edge of the porch. Memories surged without warning, laughter echoing from the kitchen years ago, the sound of boots by the door that would never come again. He gripped the railing, knuckles whitening, anger and grief tangling into something sharp and unmanageable. Inside, Emily waited. She did not follow. She understood that some storms needed space to break. When Jacob returned, his eyes were red-rimmed, his expression controlled but exhausted. He did not sit immediately. I'm not good at this, he said. Letting people close. I know, Emily replied. I don't want to hurt you. She met his gaze steadily. You won't. Not by being honest. Silence fell again, but this time it was different. Something had been exposed, and neither pretended otherwise. The next day brought another complication. A truck pulled into the drive shortly after noon, unfamiliar and loud against the quiet valley. Jacob recognized it instantly. "Tom Bennett," he muttered. Emily looked up from where she was mending a tear in Jacob's jacket. "Friend?" "Neighbor," Jacob said. "Or he used to be." Tom Bennett stepped out of the truck, tall and solidly built, early 50s, with a thick gray beard and a face permanently set in a half squint, as if the world had disappointed him too many times. He walked with the confidence of someone who expected to be welcomed, though his eyes scanned the cabin with sharp interest. "Didn't know you had company," Tom said, nodding toward Emily. "Didn't advertise," Jacob replied. Tom's gaze lingered a moment too long. "Town's talking." Emily rose, extending a hand. "Emily." Tom took it, his grip firm. "Tom." He turned back to Jacob. "You all right?" Jacob knew the question carried weight beyond its words. "I am." Tom studied him, then nodded once. "Good. Just thought you should know. Hank's been saying things." Jacob's shoulders tensed. "What things?" "That you're changing." Tom shrugged. "Some folks don't like that." Emily watched the exchange carefully. She saw the old reflex in Jacob, the instinct to retreat, to brace for impact. Tom tipped his hat and left without further explanation. That evening, Emily said quietly, "You don't owe the town an explanation." Jacob nodded. "I know." "But you might owe yourself one," she added. He looked at her, seeing not pressure, but invitation. The work continued the next day. Repairs progressed. Life moved forward inch by inch, and though Jacob still feared what opening his heart might cost him, he could no longer deny the truth rising beneath that fear. Sharing grief had not destroyed him, it had steadied him. The week after Tom Bennett's visit unfolded with a tension that never quite named itself. Nothing overt changed. Jacob still rose before dawn, still split wood and repaired beams with the same careful precision, but the valley no longer felt neutral. The mountains watched more closely. The road carried sound farther. Even the quiet seemed alert. Emily sensed it in the way Jacob paused before starting the truck, scanning the ridge as if expecting interruption. She sensed it in the way Bear lifted his head at every distant engine, ears pricked, old instincts refusing to dull with age. The dog was restless those days, pacing between the porch and the tree line, his graying muzzle lifted to the wind. On the fourth morning, the knock came. It was firm, unhurried, the kind that assumed an answer. Jacob opened the door to find Hank Rowe standing on the porch. Up close, Hank looked older than Emily had realized in town, mid-50s maybe. His face was narrow and sharp-edged, beard untrimmed and streaked heavily with white. His eyes were pale and direct, the gaze of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He wore a heavy coat that had once been expensive and boots that had never seen mud. "Jacob," Hank said, nodding, "didn't expect you to open it yourself." "Didn't expect company," Jacob replied. Hank's eyes flicked past him into the cabin, landing briefly on Emily. "Still didn't." Emily stood from the table, setting aside the mending she'd been working on. "Good morning," she said calmly. Hank ignored her, addressing Jacob again. "Town's got concerns." Jacob stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind him. "Then, town should mind its own business." Hank's mouth tightened. "You're hosting someone long-term without saying a word. Folks notice that." Jacob crossed his arms, broad shoulders blocking the view of the cabin. "I don't owe explanations." "Used to agree," Hank said, "before you started changing." That word again. "What exactly do you want?" Jacob asked. Hank hesitated, then spoke plainly. "People are worried about your judgment, about what comes next." Jacob felt something rise in his chest, not anger exactly, but resolve. "I'm not a child." "No," Hank agreed, "but grief makes fools of men." The words struck hard. Behind the door, Emily heard everything. She did not move closer, did not retreat. She understood that this was Jacob's fight to choose, not hers to interrupt. Jacob stepped closer to Hank, lowering his voice. "You don't get to use my past to police my present." Hank studied him, eyes narrowing. "That woman—" "Her name is Emily." Silence fell between them. Hank exhaled slowly. "If she stays, there will be consequences." Jacob did not hesitate. "Then she stays." Hank stared at him for a long moment, searching for the hesitation he expected to find. When he didn't, his posture stiffened. "You've made your choice." "Yes," Jacob said. "I have." Hank turned and left without another word. Jacob stood on the porch long after the sound of the truck faded. The cold bit into his hands, but he didn't notice. When he went back inside, Emily met his gaze. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "I did," Jacob replied, "because it was true." That night, the wind returned, sharp and persistent, rattling the windows like a warning. Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to Jacob move in the other room. She wondered how many times he had stood alone against the world like this, choosing isolation because it required less courage than defiance. The next morning brought another complication. Bear did not rise from his bed. Emily noticed first. The dog lay curled near the stove, breathing shallowly, eyes half open but unfocused. When she touched his side, he whined softly but didn't move. "Jacob," she called. Jacob knelt immediately, hands gentle but efficient. He checked Bear's gums, his eyes, the stiffness in his legs. His jaw tightened. "He's old," Emily said. "I know," Jacob replied. They wrapped Bear in blankets and loaded him into the truck. The drive to town was silent, except for Bear's labored breathing. At the veterinary clinic, they were met by Dr. Samuel Price, a man in his early 60s with thinning hair and a permanent crease between his brows. He moved carefully, as if every gesture had been slowed by years of difficult conversations. "It's his heart," Dr. Price said after the exam. "He's been compensating for a long time. Stress likely pushed him over the edge." Emily reached for Jacob's hand without thinking. He did not pull away. "What can we do?" Jacob asked. "We can make him comfortable," Dr. Price said gently. "But you should prepare." They took Bear home. The rest of the day passed in fragments. Emily sat on the floor with Bear's head in her lap, speaking softly. Jacob worked without purpose, starting tasks he did not finish, pacing the length of the cabin and back again. That evening, Bear's breathing slowed. Jacob lay beside him on the floor, one hand resting on the dog's chest, feeling each breath like a countdown. "I found him as a pup," Jacob said hoarsely. "Right after my wife died, he wouldn't leave my porch." Emily listened, tears slipping silently down her face. When Bear finally went still, the cabin felt unbearably quiet. They buried him beneath the pine tree near the shed, the one that had fallen weeks before. Jacob carved a simple marker, hands shaking not from cold but from loss. Afterward, he stood alone while Emily waited by the porch, giving him space. That night, Jacob did not sleep. The following morning, he made a decision he had avoided for years. "We're going into town," he said. Emily looked up. "Are you sure?" "Yes." They arrived at the general store just before noon. Conversations faltered as they entered. Eyes followed them. Whispers rose and fell. Jacob did not lower his head. Mabel Green emerged from behind the counter, wiping her hands. "Well," she said briskly. "About time." Jacob nodded. "I need to say something." The room stilled. "This is Emily," Jacob said, his voice steady. "She's staying with me. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me." Silence stretched, heavy and uncertain. Then, Mabel smiled. "That's settled then?" A few people laughed nervously. Others looked away. Hank was not there. Emily exhaled slowly. Outside, as they returned to the truck, Emily touched Jacob's arm. "That couldn't have been easy." "It was necessary," he replied. "I'm tired of living like my life is something to be hidden." Emily smiled softly. "I'm glad you chose not to hide." As they drove back toward the mountains, Jacob felt the grief still present, still heavy. But beneath it, something else had taken root. He had stood his ground, and the world had not ended. Spring arrived the way it always did in the high country, without apology and without certainty. One day the valley breathed cold and gray. The next it softened, patches of earth appearing like secrets the snow had kept too long. Jacob noticed the change in the ground before he noticed it in himself. The thaw loosened the soil, the roads, and something quieter in his chest that had been clenched for years. Emily marked the season by planting. She chose the narrow strip behind the cabin, tested the earth with her fingers, and worked until her knuckles darkened with dirt. Jacob watched from the porch, measuring boards for the shed, noting how she leaned into the work, careful with her knee, steady with everything else. She wore an old denim jacket cinched at the waist, hair tied back in a low knot, face calm and intent. She didn't garden like someone passing time. She gardened like someone laying claim. The town's attention faded, not because it disappeared, but because it found other places to land. Hank Rowe kept his distance. Tom Bennett nodded from his truck when they crossed paths on the road. Mabel Green sent bread with a boy who looked terrified to be the messenger. Life resumed its ordinary negotiations. Then the letter came. It arrived folded and thin, slipped into the box with a weight that had nothing to do with paper. Emily recognized the handwriting before she opened it. Her sister's, looping and tight, shaped by years of trying to fit too much worry into too little space. She read it standing by the window, lips pressed together, the sound of the page louder than it should have been. "What is it?" Jacob asked. Emily took a breath that did not quite steady her. "My sister. In Oregon." He waited. "She fell. Broke her hip. The doctors think she'll recover, but..." Emily folded the letter carefully. "She's asking if I can come help. Just for a while." The words landed between them, clean and sharp. "How long is a while?" Jacob asked. Emily shook her head. "She doesn't know. Months, maybe." Jacob nodded once. He did not reach for her. He did not speak again until he was certain his voice would not betray him. "You should go." Emily looked at him, surprised by the immediacy. "I didn't say I would." "You didn't have to," he replied. "You're needed." "So am I here," she said quietly. The truth of that statement unsettled him more than the letter. He turned back to the shed, hands resuming their work with exaggerated care. "You don't owe me anything." Emily stepped closer. "I know, that's not what this is." They didn't argue. They didn't decide. They let the matter rest, heavy and unresolved, like a storm sitting beyond the ridge. 2 days later, the storm came anyway. A late-season wind tore through the valley, dry and sudden, carrying the smell of pine and dust. By afternoon, smoke threaded the air in thin, uncertain lines. Jacob recognized it immediately. "Fire," he said. They packed with efficiency born of practice they had hoped never to need. Water, documents, clothes. Emily wrapped the seedlings in damp cloths, an act Jacob noticed and did not question. He loaded the truck while she moved through the cabin with deliberate calm, closing windows, checking the stove, as if order itself might hold the flames at bay. The fire advanced faster than expected. Sirens wailed from the road below, the sound thin and urgent against the roar of wind. They met the volunteer fire crew at the bend, men and women in mismatched gear, faces grim. At the center stood Luke Alvarez, early 30s, lean and sun-darkened, with a jaw set hard by responsibility. His beard was trimmed close, his eyes quick and assessing. He had grown up in this valley, lost his father to a logging accident when he was 17, and learned early that leadership often meant choosing who could be saved. "You need to evacuate now," Luke said. "Wind's shifting." Jacob glanced toward the cabin. "We can hold." Luke shook his head. "Not this one." Emily touched Jacob's arm. "We need to go." The decision cost him more than he expected. He nodded, climbed into the truck, and drove away as smoke thickened, swallowing the familiar shape of the ridge. They waited through the night at the community hall, the air heavy with fear and coffee. Emily moved among the neighbors, offering blankets, listening. Jacob sat apart, hands folded, watching the door. Near dawn, Luke returned, soot-streaked and exhausted. "You're clear," he said. "The fire broke before it reached your place. The shed's damaged. The cabin stands." Relief struck Jacob so hard he had to sit down. They drove back through a landscape changed but intact. Blackened patches scarred the hillside. The shed bore a burn mark along one corner, ugly but survivable. Emily ran her hand over the charred wood, then rested her forehead briefly against it. That afternoon, as ash settled like gray snow, Emily spoke again of the letter. "I can't ignore it," she said, "but I don't want to leave like this." Jacob understood what she meant, leaving without choice, leaving because fear demanded it. "If you go," he said carefully, "go because you're choosing to, not because this place scares you." She met his eyes. "If I go, it's because my sister needs me, not because I'm afraid to stay." The distinction mattered. It mattered enough to steady him. They worked together the next days repairing the shed, the labor grounding them. At night they sat on the porch, the sky clearing inch by inch, the valley smelling of wet ash and new growth. On the fifth evening, Emily packed a small bag. "I'll go," she said. "For a few weeks. I need to see her settled." Jacob's throat tightened. "And then?" "And then," she said, "I come back, if you'll have me." He did not answer. Immediately. He thought of the fire, the letter, the long habit of choosing solitude because it hurt less than hope. "You don't need permission," he said finally. Emily smiled, a soft, tired curve of relief. "I know, but I want it." Jacob stepped closer, the space between them closing with a finality that surprised him. "Then come back," he said. "This place." He gestured to the valley, the cabin, the ground they had broken together. "This place is better with you in it." They drove to town the next morning. Mabel Green hugged Emily hard, pressing a paper bag of food into her hands. Luke Alvarez nodded from his truck, eyes lingering on the repaired shed, on Jacob's set jaw. At the bus stop, Emily paused. The bus idled, loud and impatient. "This isn't goodbye," she said. "I know," Jacob replied. He reached for her, the motion no longer tentative, and held her with a certainty he had not known he possessed. When the bus pulled away, Jacob stood until it disappeared beyond the bend. The valley felt quieter without her, but not empty. The difference mattered. He returned to the cabin, set the kettle on, and sat at the table. For the first time in years, waiting did not feel like punishment. It felt like faith. Summer arrived without announcement, the way it often did in the high country. One long day sliding into another, until the light stayed late and the air softened. The valley healed itself in small, determined gestures. Grass pushed through blackened soil where the fire had passed. Pines released fresh needles. The scar along the shed faded from harsh charcoal to a muted gray that no longer demanded attention. Jacob noticed these changes the way he noticed most things now, carefully, without resistance. Emily's absence reshaped his days, but it did not hollow them out. That surprised him. He worked the same hours, repaired the same structures, but something fundamental had shifted. Waiting no longer felt like standing still. It felt like preparation. He fixed the shed properly this time, replacing beams rather than bracing them. He repaired the porch rail Emily had once leaned against, sanding the rough edge smooth. He planted a second row of vegetables beside the first, remembering how she had pressed seedlings into the soil with deliberate gentleness. Each task carried the quiet assumption that someone else would notice. That assumption was new. In town, the conversations changed tone. People still watched him, but curiosity replaced suspicion. Mabel Green asked after Emily without pretense. Luke Alvarez waved when their paths crossed, his expression easy now that the fires had passed. Even Hank Rowe nodded once from across the street, the gesture stiff but real. Jacob did not seek approval. He accepted acknowledgement. The letter came in mid-July. He recognized Emily's handwriting immediately, still neat, still confident, but lighter now, as if the lines no longer carried the full weight of responsibility alone. He sat at the table to read it, sunlight cutting across the wood in warm bands. Her sister's recovery was slow but steady. Physical therapy, long afternoons, small victories. Emily wrote of fatigue, of moments when she missed the mountains with an ache that surprised her. She wrote of choosing to stay longer than planned because leaving too soon would have meant regret, and she had learned the cost of those. At the end of the letter, she wrote simply, "I'll be home in 3 weeks, if that still feels right to you." Jacob folded the paper carefully. He did not pace. He did not hesitate. He wrote back that evening, "It does." The morning Emily returned, the sky was clear and wide, the kind of blue that made distance feel manageable. Jacob drove into town earlier than necessary, parked across from the diner, and waited. He didn't feel the old tightening in his chest. Anticipation, yes. Fear, no. When the bus pulled in, he saw her immediately. She stepped down with the same steady posture, a little thinner perhaps, her hair shorter than before, cut for convenience rather than style. Her face carried new lines of tiredness, but her eyes were clear. When she saw him, she smiled, not tentative, not relieved, just present. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he answered and took her bag without asking. The drive back up the ridge passed mostly in quiet, not because there was nothing to say, but because they understood that arrival did not require explanation. When the cabin came into view, Emily exhaled slowly, like someone stepping into familiar ground after a long journey. "It looks good," she said. "It waited," Jacob replied. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood and summer. Emily ran her hand along the table, the back of the chair, the window frame she had once cleaned during a storm. She stopped near the doorway, turning to face him. "I'm here," she said. "Not temporarily." Jacob nodded, the movement small but final. "So am I." They did not mark the moment with grand declarations. They marked it with action. Emily unpacked. Jacob made coffee. Life resumed, not where it had paused, but somewhere sturdier. Days settled into rhythm. They worked side by side without negotiation. Emily took over the garden fully, expanding it beyond what Jacob would have attempted alone. She fixed the fence where snow melt had weakened it, learned the road schedules, memorized the weather patterns the way some people memorized prayers. Jacob watched, not with fear of loss, but with recognition. This was what partnership looked like when stripped of performance. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching light slide off the mountains, Emily spoke quietly. "I don't want a life that feels like an escape," she said. "I want one that feels chosen." Jacob leaned back, hands resting on his thighs. "I spent a long time choosing what hurt least. And now? Now I'm choosing what's honest." She smiled at that. In August, the town held its annual gathering. Nothing formal, just a shared meal near the community hall, long tables set under strings of lights. Jacob had avoided it for years. This time, he went. Emily walked beside him, her hand occasionally brushing his arm. People greeted them easily. Mabel pressed food into Emily's hands and winked at Jacob. Luke nodded from across the crowd, relaxed now that summer had stayed kind. As dusk settled, music drifted from a small speaker. Children ran. Laughter rose and fell. Jacob stood quietly at the edge, observing, until Emily turned to him. "Dance with me," she said. "I don't dance." "You stand," she replied. "I'll do the rest." He hesitated, then followed her onto the worn grass. He placed his hands awkwardly at first, then steadied them at her waist. They moved slowly, barely moving at all, but it was enough. It was more than enough. Later that night, back at the cabin, Jacob stood by the window, watching moonlight silver the clearing. Emily joined him, resting her head briefly against his shoulder. "I don't need promises," she said. "I need commitment that shows up." Jacob considered that, then reached into the drawer beside the table. He took out a small box, not polished, not new. Inside was a simple ring, unadorned, solid. "I don't know how to do this loudly," he said, "but I know how to stay." Emily turned to face him fully. "Then stay with me." He slid the ring onto her finger, the gesture deliberate and steady. There was no audience, no ceremony, only truth. They married in late September, beneath the same pine where Bear had been buried. Mabel organized food. Luke stood nearby, hands folded, smiling. The town gathered without spectacle. The mountains watched, indifferent but enduring. Years later, people would say Jacob Miller changed. They would say love softened him. They would be wrong. Love did not soften Jacob. It steadied him. It taught him that loss was not a warning to retreat, but a reason to build something worth guarding. On quiet evenings, when the light lingered and the valley breathed easily, Jacob would sit beside Emily on the porch, the place no longer a shelter from grief, but a home shaped by choice. And in that chosen quiet, he finally understood what he had been surviving for. Sometimes, miracles do not arrive as thunder or light from the sky. Sometimes, they arrive quietly, through endurance, through kindness, through the courage to open a heart that has been closed for a long time. Jacob did not lose his pain. He did not forget his past, but God did not ask him to forget. God simply asked him to trust again. In our daily lives, many of us carry grief that no one sees. We wake up, we work, we endure, and we tell ourselves that survival is enough. But faith reminds us that we were not created only to survive. We were created to love, to heal, and to be healed. If you are watching this and feel alone, remember this. God often works through people, through second chances, and through moments that feel small but change everything. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what this story reminded you of. And if you believe that love and faith still matter, subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing stories like this together. May God bless you, protect you, and guide you. May He bring peace to your home, strength to your heart, and light to your path today and always.